Okay, so we're diving into some pretty intense stuff today, folks.
Intense is putting it mildly.
We're talking about Plato's Republic, Book 5, where Socrates lays out this wild vision for an ideal city.
A vision that really makes you question everything you thought you knew about society.
Exactly. We're talking about gender roles, family structures, the whole shebang, and Socrates doesn't hold back.
No, he does not.
So, to kick things off, Socrates introduces us to these guardians, the elite class responsible for running and protecting the city.
And right off the bat, he says this guardian class should include both men and women.
Which, for ancient Greece, was a pretty revolutionary idea.
Oh, absolutely. Socrates was basically saying that your abilities and virtues should determine your role, not your gender.
But, and here's where things get a little tricky, Socrates also suggests that women, even those in the guardian class, should be given lighter tasks. Because, and I'm quoting here, their sex is weaker.
Yes. Even our forward-thinking philosopher wasn't entirely free from the prevailing beliefs of his time.
It's a bit of a head-scratcher for sure. But then Socrates drops a real bombshell.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What's the bombshell?
He says these guardians, both men and women, should have absolutely no private property.
Whoa.
And get this, no families either. He envisions them living communally, sharing everything, including spouses and children.
Okay, now we're talking radical. What's the logic behind this?
Socrates argues that this radical communal living is the key to creating a truly unified and harmonious city.
By eliminating things like inheritance squabbles and family feuds.
Exactly. He believes that if everyone is truly equal and shares everything, there's no room for jealousy, rivalry, or selfish desires.
It all becomes about the collective good, the well-being of the city as a whole.
Precisely. Socrates argues that traditional family structures and private ownership are the root of societal problems.
So by removing those things, you eliminate the sources of conflict and disharmony.
That's the idea. People fighting over inheritances, parents favoring their own children over others, those things would cease to exist in his ideal city.
It's certainly a radical solution, but is it really the only way to achieve unity and harmony? Couldn't you address those problems within the existing social structures?
That's a good question, and it's one that Socrates doesn't fully address. He seems pretty convinced that this complete restructuring of society is necessary to achieve true justice and happiness.
But wouldn't such a system require a level of social control that's a bit unsettling?
It definitely raises some red flags, especially for those of us who value individual freedom and autonomy. But Socrates argues that this system wouldn't be about control, but about fostering a deep sense of unity and shared purpose.
Because if everything truly belongs to everyone, there's no incentive for greed or self-interest.
Exactly. And without those things driving human behavior, Socrates believes that people would naturally prioritize the well-being of the community above their own individual desires.
It's an interesting concept, for sure, but is it really humanly possible to achieve that level of detachment from our innate desires for personal ownership and family bonds?
That's a big question. Can we truly overcome our ingrained instincts, our biological predispositions, to create a society where everyone feels a deep responsibility for the well-being of all, regardless of biological relationships?
It's hard to imagine, but Socrates seems to believe that it's possible that through careful education and social engineering, we can create a society where individual identity is completely subsumed by the collective good.
And that's where things get really interesting. How do you actually implement a system like this? Who decides who gets to reproduce with whom? Who determines which children are raised in the guardian class and which ones aren't?
These are practical questions that Socrates does try to address. He emphasizes the need for wise and virtuous rulers to oversee this system.
So these philosopher kings would be responsible for making all these life-altering decisions.
Essentially, yes. Socrates argues that these rulers would need to be exceptionally impartial, dedicated to the good of the city, and completely free from any personal biases or corrupting influences.
So it all hinges on finding these perfect, incorruptible individuals to guide the whole thing.
It seems that way, and that's a pretty big gamble, wouldn't you say?
A huge gamble, especially when you consider how much power these rulers would have.
Exactly. Even if you could find individuals who were genuinely wise and benevolent, the potential for abuse is always there. Power, especially unchecked power, has a way of corrupting even the best of intentions.
Even if you buy into Socrates' vision of an ideal society, the practical implementation seems fraught with peril.
Absolutely. It raises all sorts of questions about human nature, the limits of social engineering, and the delicate balance between individual freedom and the demands of the collective.
Okay, so we've talked about the guardians, the abolition of private property and family, and the emphasis on communal living. We've touched on the practical challenges of implementing such a radical system. But how does all of this connect to the overall concept of justice that Socrates is exploring in the Republic?
That's the key question, isn't it? What does all of this have to do with justice?
Because for Socrates, justice isn't just about fairness or individual rights. It's about fulfilling your designated role within society and contributing to the overall harmony of the city.
So a just individual is someone who puts the needs of the city above their own.
Exactly. And Socrates believes that by eliminating private property and traditional family bonds, you remove the primary sources of conflict and division that prevent true justice from flourishing.
So in this system, justice is about everyone staying in their lane, doing what they're supposed to do without questioning the established order.
Precisely. And while that might sound appealing on the surface, it does raise some concerns about individual freedom and the potential for tyranny.
Absolutely. It seems like there's very little room for dissent or individual expression in Socrates' ideal city.
The individual is completely subsumed by the collective, and any deviation from the prescribed roles and behaviors is seen as a threat to the harmony and stability of the whole.
It's a thought-provoking model for sure, but it's hard to imagine it working in practice without some pretty serious ethical and logistical challenges.
And that's what makes Plato's Republic such a fascinating and enduring text. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, the role of the state, and the limits of human perfectibility.
It's a reminder that even the most utopian visions can have their dark sides, and that the pursuit of a just and harmonious society is a complex and often messy endeavor. So we left off talking about how Socrates believes that by getting rid of private property and family ties, you create a society where everybody's on the same page, working toward a shared goal.
No more of those messy personal agendas or people putting their family's interests above the needs of the city.
And it's not just about eliminating conflict. Socrates actually believes that this communal living would lead to a more fulfilling life for everyone.
More fulfilling. How?
He argues that without private property and the constant pursuit of individual wealth, people would be free from all the burdens of material possessions and all the anxieties that come with them.
Okay, so less stuff, less stress. I can see the appeal of that. But wouldn't it also stifle ambition and innovation? If there's no reward for individual achievement, wouldn't people just become complacent?
Socrates doesn't seem too worried about that. He really believes that true fulfillment comes from serving the community, not from chasing personal goals or accumulating wealth.
It's definitely a different way of looking at things, a pretty radical departure from the way our society operates, where individual success is, pretty much the gold standard.
But Socrates is asking us to consider a different set of values, one based on cooperation, shared responsibility, and really a dedication to the common good. It's a pretty idealistic vision.
Idealistic for sure. But how do you translate that vision into reality? How do you actually go about structuring a society like this?
Socrates gets into the nitty-gritty details. He describes this system of controlled mating festivals where the rulers carefully pair the best men and women together to create the most capable future guardians.
Wait, hold on. The state gets to decide who reproduces with whom. That sounds a little, I don't know, dystopian maybe.
It definitely pushes the boundaries of what we consider acceptable in terms of individual freedom and autonomy. But Socrates believes that this kind of selective breeding, if you will, is essential for ensuring the long-term stability and wisdom of the ruling class.
And I can see how that logic might appeal to someone who's obsessed with creating the perfect society. But who gets to decide who the best people are? And what criteria are they using to make those judgments? It seems like there's a lot of room for bias and, frankly, abuse of power in a system like that.
You're hitting on some of the major criticisms of Socrates' model, because even if the rulers have the best intentions, who's to say that their definition of best aligns with what's actually good for the city as a whole?
And even if you could find these perfectly impartial, all-knowing rulers, wouldn't the system just reinforce existing social hierarchies? Who gets labeled as best is often determined by who already holds power and privilege.
That's a valid point, and it highlights the potential for Socrates' system to actually perpetuate inequality rather than eliminate it.
Okay, so we've got these controlled mating festivals, this idea that the state has a say in who reproduces and with whom. What about the children? What happens to them once they're born?
Socrates believes that children should be raised communally, taken from their parents at birth and raised by designated nurses in a separate part of the city.
So no parent-child recognition, no traditional family structure at all.
The idea is to create this strong sense of collective identity where loyalty to the state trumps any individual or familial bonds.
But wouldn't that have a profound impact on human development? We're social creatures wired for connection and attachment. To completely sever those bonds seems, I don't know, unnatural, maybe even harmful.
It certainly raises questions about the psychological and emotional well-being of both the children and the parents in such a system. Socrates doesn't really address those concerns in any detail.
It seems like he's so focused on achieving this perfect unity and harmony that he's overlooking some pretty fundamental aspects of human nature.
That's one of the main criticisms of his model, that it's too idealistic, too detached from the realities of human experience.
Okay, so we've talked about mating festivals, communal child rearing, the rule of philosopher kings. It's clear that Socrates' vision for an ideal city is, let's just say it's unconventional. But what about the rest of the citizens, the ones who aren't part of this elite guardian class? How do they fit into this whole scheme?
That's an important question, because Socrates doesn't provide as much detail about the lives of the non-guardian citizens, but he does make some interesting observations about the relationship between the rulers and the ruled.
Yeah, okay, let's hear it. What does he have to say about that dynamic?
He points out that in other cities, the ones he considers less than ideal, the rulers are often referred to as masters, while the common people are seen as their slaves.
That's not exactly a recipe for a happy and equitable society.
Exactly. But in Socrates' ideal city, the language is different. The guardians are seen as saviors and defenders, while the common people are referred to as paymasters and providers.
So it's more of a mutually beneficial partnership, each group fulfilling a specific role that contributes to the well-being of the whole.
Precisely. The guardians protect the city, and the common people provide for their material needs. But even with this seemingly more egalitarian language, there's still a clear power imbalance. The guardians are ultimately the ones making the decisions, setting the rules, and wielding authority.
And let's not forget, these guardians have been specially bred and trained for their roles. They've been raised from birth to prioritize the good of the city above all else. So even if they view themselves as saviors, can they really understand the needs and desires of the common people who haven't undergone that same rigorous conditioning?
That's a good point. It raises the question of whether a ruling class that's so removed from the lived experiences of the majority can truly govern effectively and justly.
Because even with the best intentions, there's always the risk of a disconnect between those in power and those they govern. And without mechanisms for accountability or feedback from the common people, that disconnect could easily lead to tyranny, even if it's disguised as benevolence.
That's one of the inherent dangers of any system where power is concentrated in the hands of a select few, no matter how wise or virtuous those individuals may be.
Okay, so Socrates' vision for an ideal city has some, shall we say, interesting features. Communal living, controlled reproduction, a ruling class of philosopher kings. But it seems like there are also some serious potential downsides, some ethical and logistical challenges that are hard to ignore.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that he's presenting an idealized model, a thought experiment. He's not necessarily saying that this is how things should be in the real world.
It's more about pushing the boundaries of our thinking, forcing us to confront these fundamental questions about power, justice, and the nature of a good society.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Republic has remained so influential over the centuries. It forces us to grapple with these big, messy questions that are still relevant today. Questions about the role of government, individual freedom, and the tension between the needs of the individual and the needs of the collective.
Okay, so we've talked about Socrates' vision for this ideal city. We've touched on some of the more controversial aspects of his model, the communal living, the controlled mating, the philosopher kings calling the shots. But there's one piece of the puzzle that we haven't really explored yet.
And that is
Education. If Socrates is so focused on creating this perfectly just and harmonious society, surely he has some pretty specific ideas about how to educate the citizens of this ideal city.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, education is central to Socrates' whole vision. He devotes a significant portion of the Republic to outlining a detailed curriculum for the guardians, covering everything from music and poetry to mathematics and philosophy. He really believes that education is the key to creating virtuous and capable leaders who can guide the city toward justice and harmony.
So it's not just about breeding the right people, it's about educating them in a way that cultivates the specific qualities that Socrates deems essential for good leadership.
Exactly. He sees education as a process of shaping the character, the soul of the individual. And he believes that a rigorous and well-designed education system is crucial for ensuring that the guardians possess the wisdom, virtue, and just overall sense of justice that's necessary to rule effectively and ethically.
Okay, so let's dive into this educational program. What does Socrates' ideal curriculum look like? What are the key elements? What skills and knowledge does he believe are essential for these future leaders to possess?
So we were just starting to talk about Socrates' ideas on education for the guardians in his ideal city.
Yeah, because it seems like if you're going to create this perfectly just and harmonious society, education has got to play a key role, right? You can't just breed people and hope for the best.
Exactly. Socrates believes that education is absolutely essential for shaping the kind of citizens who can uphold justice and maintain harmony in the city. He even outlines this incredibly detailed curriculum for the guardians.
Oh, really? So what's on the syllabus for these future philosopher kings?
It's pretty comprehensive. He includes everything from music and poetry to mathematics and philosophy. He really believes that a well-rounded education is key to developing not just intellectual skills, but also moral character.
So it's about more than just like memorizing facts and figures. It's about cultivating a certain way of thinking, a certain way of being in the world.
Precisely. Socrates sees education as this process of shaping the soul, of instilling in the guardians the virtues and wisdom necessary to rule justly and effectively.
Okay, so it's a pretty rigorous program, then.
Oh, absolutely. He emphasizes the importance of both physical and intellectual training. He actually believes that physical discipline and self-control are crucial for developing a well-ordered soul.
So like a healthy body leads to a healthy mind, that kind of thing.
Something like that, yeah. He sees a strong connection between physical fitness and moral character.
Interesting. So we've got physical training, we've got intellectual pursuits like math and philosophy. What about the arts? Does Socrates think they have a place in this ideal education system?
He does, but he's very particular about the kinds of art that the guardians should be exposed to. He believes that certain types of music and poetry can inspire virtue and noble sentiments.
Whereas others might corrupt their souls and lead them astray.
Exactly. He's very careful about curating the cultural influences that shape the guardian's moral development.
It's interesting how much emphasis he puts on controlling the environment, not just in terms of social structures, but also the cultural input that these future leaders are exposed to.
Because for Socrates, it's all interconnected. The social structure, the education system, the cultural milieu, it all works together to shape the character of the citizens and ultimately the fate of the city itself.
Okay, so back to this idea of a carefully crafted education system for the guardians. It seems if Socrates believes so strongly in the power of education to shape virtuous and capable leaders, why even bother with a controlled breeding? Wouldn't a good education be enough to instill the right values and skills?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the age-old debate about nature versus nurture. Socrates seems to believe that both play a role.
You need the right raw material, the right genetic predisposition, A&D, the right environment to create these ideal rulers.
What seems to be his thinking, yeah. He argues that some individuals are just naturally more inclined toward virtue and wisdom than others, and that a good education can nurture and develop those qualities, but it can't create them out of thin air.
So it's like a two-pronged approach then. You select for the best traits through controlled reproduction A&D. You cultivate those traits through a rigorous education system.
Exactly, and you can see how that might appeal to someone who is trying to engineer the perfect society. But it also raises all sorts of ethical questions about who gets to decide what those best traits are and who gets to benefit from this system.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real danger of creating a self-perpetuating elite where power and privilege are passed down from one generation to the next, regardless of individual merit or potential. And that doesn't sound very just or harmonious to me.
No, it doesn't. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from our exploration of Socrates' vision. While it's full of these fascinating ideas and thought-provoking arguments, it also reveals some of the potential pitfalls of utopian thinking.
It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned attempts to create a perfect society can have unintended consequences, and that we need to be very careful about the kind of power we give to any individual or institution, no matter how wise or benevolent they may seem.
Exactly. And I think that's a fitting place to wrap up our deep dive into Plato's Republic. It's a text that continues to challenge and inspire us, even thousands of years after it was written.
It's amazing how these ideas, as radical as they are, still resonate with us today. They force us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, the role of government, and the meaning of justice. Questions that, honestly, we're still struggling to answer.
Absolutely. And I think that's the real beauty of philosophy, of engaging with these great thinkers of the past. They push us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to imagine new possibilities for ourselves and for the world we live in.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into Plato's Republic. We hope you found it as thought-provoking and engaging as we did.
And we encourage you to keep the conversation going. What resonated with you most from our discussion? What questions are you still wrestling with? Let us know your thoughts. We're always eager to hear from you.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.